This MD-11 was en route to Hong Kong. For the crew and passengers, this trip was going to take a dramatic turn as a severe tropical storm was reaching the airport at the same time as them. This incident is both amazing and unbelievable, becoming more so when you find out what happens after the video of this crash stops recording. You're not going to want to miss this one. Stay tuned. On the 22nd of August 1999, this Boeing MD-11, operated by China Airlines, was scheduled for a flight from Bangkok in Thailand to Taipei in Taiwan. The aircraft was still carrying the Mandarin Airlines livery from its time in service with this airline. Today's flight would be carried out in 2 legs, with the intermediate stop being in Hong Kong. The crew had flown the reverse of this trip the day before, and this was a fairly routine trip for the crew of the China Airlines flight. The major difference between this flight and the others was that there was a severe tropical storm with the name Sam that was approaching Hong Kong and would possibly be within the vicinity of Hong Kong around the scheduled time of arrival. For today's flight, there were 300 passengers on board with 15 crew. The aircraft, an MD-11 manufactured by the McDonnell Douglas Corporation in 1992, it had since come under the ownership of Boeing, as Boeing had acquired and merged with McDonnell Douglas in 1997 for $13.3 billion. That would be around $26 billion in today's money. The aircraft had a valid certificate of airworthiness, which was due to expire in a month's time, and the only noteworthy points from the aircraft's history was that it had suffered 2 hard landings, one in 1995, with the nose wheel actuator pressure line being damaged and replaced, and the nose gear being removed for a detailed inspection, and a further structural repair, which was carried out on wrinkled fuselage skin. And the second hard landing was in 1997, with an inspection being accomplished with no damage found. Although unlikely, these events may have played a part in this incident. The flight crew arrived at the airport a few hours before the takeoff time of 15:40 local, and received a pre-flight briefing where they were made aware of the presence of the storm and that this could possibly bring strong winds and heavy rain. The commander was very aware of the issues surrounding those tropical storms, as the Hong Kong region would experience strong tropical storms on average 6 times per year. Because of this information, the commander requested additional fuel to give him more options should the approach not be suitable on arrival. This would give him more time to hold, make several approaches, and more flexibility with diversion airfields. The only issue that came with this additional fuel was that if an approach was carried out without needing to hold, the aircraft would be very close to its maximum landing weight, which would mean they would need higher approach and landing speeds, which again, in strong winds, the extra speed could be a good thing. Once the crew were happy with their route and options should Hong Kong not be fit for landing, the co-pilot boarded the aircraft, with the commander carrying out a walk-around of the aircraft before joining the co-pilot in the flight deck. I will refer to the flight crew as the commander and co-pilot, as this is reflective of the final report and the procedure at the time. I will also be using local times. Once the flight crew were satisfied the aircraft was ready for their scheduled trip, they signalled for the passengers to board. For the flight crew on board, the commander, he was 57 years old, with 17,900 total flying hours. 3,260 of those hours was on type on the MD-11. Before joining China Airlines in May 1997, he was an instructor pilot on the MD-11 on a major European national airline, although it is not known which airline this was. I'm sure it was known at the time, but I was unable to find this information inside or outside the final report. The co-pilots joined China Airlines in 1989 following 3 years of training in the United States. He was 36 years old and had a total of 4,630 flying hours, with 2,780 on type. For both pilots, they were medically fit and had no major comments on their flying training to date. Once all the passengers were boarded and the cabin crew set for the departure, the flight crew obtained start clearance and started the engines. The 3 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines roared into life. With the checks complete and all the indications looking in order, The crew taxied the aircraft to the holding point, before then stating that they were ready for departure. Anticipation was a little higher than normal for this trip. Even if everything was to go as planned, it would still be a less comfortable flight for both the passengers and crew. Flight 642 was cleared for takeoff. The commander lined the aircraft up on the runway, before then moving all 3 thrust levers to the takeoff thrust position. The MD-11 rolled down the runway until at 15:40, Flight 642 took off en route to Hong Kong. This leg of the flight was due to take around 3 hours, and after the initial climb, Flight 642 and its crew and passengers settled into the cruise at flight level 370, or 37,000 feet. Still very aware of the potential weather that was waiting for them, the commander was reviewing the expected crosswind component for their approach. The company's crosswinds limit for a wet runway was 24 knots. From the forecast before departing, the predicted crosswind was going to be close to that limit. For this reason, they had selected an alternate airport with a different runway alignment and better forecast weather. The commander had double-checked the extra information on Hong Kong International Airport from the Aeronautical Information Publication, or AIP. This informed the crew that when the winds were from a northwesterly to northeasterly direction, which they were today, and the speed in excess of 15 knots, significant low-level wind shear and moderate turbulence is expected to occur along the final approach due to the disturbance by the hills to the north. Severe turbulence may be expected should the wind speeds exceed 30 knots. The turbulence level is, however, less severe near touchdown than around the 1,000 to 2,000 foot points. Pilots should be well prepared for a significant crosswind at touchdown. As they flew closer to Hong Kong, they were able to get an update on the weather from the Automatic Terminal Information Service, or ATIS. This is a radio frequency that the crew can tune to get weather updates through a cycling pre-recorded audio or automated audio message. The ATIS informed the crew that the current surface wind was from 320 degrees at 30 knots, gusting 45 knots. Visibility was 1,400 meters. The clouds were scattered at 1,600 feet, with heavy rain and a warning to expect significant wind shear and severe turbulence on the approach, with the information code Whiskey. For the crosswind component, the runway in use was runway 25 left and right. This means the runway alignment was around 250 degrees, more specifically 253 degrees. With the wind currently at 320 degrees, this meant that the wind was off to the right approximately 67 degrees. The commander worked this out to give them a crosswind component of 26 knots. This was 2 knots above their maximum limit. But the forecast winds showed that the wind was becoming more westerly as the day went on. For that reason, the commander was happy to continue, but informed the co-pilot that they would monitor the winds during the descent and approach and ensure they remained within limits. As they reached the end of their cruise, at 18:14, they were handed over to Hong Kong radar and informed that they could descend to flight level 260 when ready. The crew of flight 642 acknowledged this, with the commander requesting the co-pilot check to see if the ATIS is the same. They quickly heard that the ATIS had been updated, as the information code had changed from Whiskey to X-ray. The updated ATIS informed the crew that the surface wind was now coming from 300 degrees at 35 knots. Visibility was 800 meters in heavy rain, with the cloud base the same being scattered at 1,600 feet. The new wind direction made it so they could continue on the approach, as the crosswind was currently within limits. As they were about to start their descent, they noticed a large weather cell on their route to the south of Hong Kong. They made the decision to fly north on a heading of 360 degrees to avoid the weather. This was approved by air traffic control, who then informed them that they could descend flight level 130 when ready. The crew discussed the new weather information and the route around the main cell of the weather, and then informed air traffic control that they were leaving flight level 370 for flight level 130. At this point, the crew were still not sure if the weather would be fit to land, but they were going to continue as normal and decide once they had all the information closer to the runway. They still had the option to go around and hold, attempt many more approaches, or divert. As they were descending, the commander now started to brief the approach for the instrument landing system on runway 25 left. As the commander was highlighting the minimum altitude they could fly to without being visual of the runway, the co-pilot stepped in and stated that they were cleared for the instrument landing system, or ILS, approach for runway 25 right, not 25 left. Before rebriefing the approach for the other runway, the co-pilot suggested that they were now clear of the weather. The co-pilots confirmed this, and after 6 minutes of heading north, at 18:20 flight 642 turned east and headed direct to waypoint Mango, which was part of the arrival procedure to Hong Kong International Airport. Now on their new heading, the commander briefed the approach for the ILS on runway 25 right. They set the aircraft up for this approach with the new ILS frequency set of 110.9. With the weather enclosing around them, the crew again discussed the weather at the airport. The wind was now within limits, but the visibility was becoming the issue, as it was reported at 800 meters. They would need the visibility at or above 800 meters to fly a Cat 1 ILS. At 18:25, they were informed to contact approach 119.35. Still descending to flight level 130, when they made contact with approach, they were cleared to continue descent to 8,000 feet on the QNH of 986 hectopascals. It was at this point that the wall of rain made contact with the aircraft. For the passengers, they could hear the rain striking the fuselage and wings of the aircraft, and with each flash of the lights, they could see the reflection of the rain. The aircraft started to rock in the turbulent air generated by the storm, with the tension rising as they descended into the darkness. In the cockpit, the pilots, still heading towards the ILS for runway 25 right, switched on the anti-ice to prevent the rain from freezing on the aircraft. They then set the automatic brakes to medium and discussed adding 20 knots to their landing speed, as they would be very heavy on their first approach, and it will also assist in the gusty conditions. Hong Kong approach now reported to all aircraft that the traffic that had just landed reported a lightning strike at 400 feet just before landing. Flight 642 acknowledged this. They were still descending to 8,000 feet with approximately 15 minutes to landing. The co-pilots now overheard another aircraft requesting to land on runway 25 left. Again, the crew were a little confused that the other aircraft would request the other runway when they were on 25 right. For the next 10 minutes, the descent and approach ran smoothly. Air traffic control started providing radar vectors to guide the aircraft to intercept the ILS. They were cleared to descend to 4,500 feet and to reduce speed to 180 knots. The crew started to configure the aircraft for landing, first with the slats and then the flaps to 15. Still expecting to be vectored for the ILS on runway 25 right, Hong Kong approach then informed flight 642 to turn left heading 230 degrees to intercept the localizer from the right side. Cleared for the ILS runway 25 left. The commander confirmed for ILS 25 left, with air traffic control repeating the clearance. In the cockpit, the crew looked at each other and realised that they had briefed and input the ILS for 25 right and not 25 left. The commander now quickly briefed the prominent points from the approach, including the new minimum of 227 feet and the missed approach should they go around. The aircraft now intercepted the localizer, however, this was still the localizer for 25 right. Although these runways were very close together, if they continued, the aircraft would take them to the wrong runway. Realising the mistake, the crew retuned the ILS frequency to 108.9, which was the correct ILS for runway 25 left. They brought the aircraft to the left and intercepted the new localizer. They still had 14 miles to go, with the aircraft picking up the glide slope for the ILS and the autopilot starting to descend towards the runway. The crew of flight 642 were now informed to contact Hong Kong Tower on 118.4. When the crew made contact with Tower, they were informed that they were number 2 to land, with the wind coming from 330 at 26 knots, gusting 36. Throughout the day, many aircraft had to call off their approach and go around. This picture was improving as the day went on, and over the previous hour, 6 aircraft had landed successfully, with only one having to go around. However, the aircraft to go around was at 18:34, 10 minutes before Flight 642 was due to land. With the updated wind from the tower of 26 knots from 330 degrees, the commander acknowledged, "We can't do it. Another wind check below 1,000 feet. This still gave the crew plenty of time to carry out a missed approach if the wind did not improve. The crew now selected the gear down and the flaps to 35 before carrying out their final checklist. The autopilot and autothrottle were managing to keep the aircraft relatively stable in the gusty conditions. Flight 642 were then cleared to land with the wind reported from 320 degrees at 25 knots. As the aircraft passed through 700 feet, the commander disconnected the autopilot and he continued to fly the aircraft down the glide slope, with the approach remaining stable, albeit slightly low. The crew became visual with the approach lights for the runway. The MD-11 was crabbing towards the runway with the nose approximately 15 to 20 degrees to the right of the centerline to compensate for the wind. The commander again asked for an update on the wind. Air traffic control informed them that it was coming from 320 degrees at 28 knots. Although the crew could see the approach lights, they were struggling to see through the heavy rain. They selected the windscreen wipers to the fast position to improve the visibility. The commander was flying the aircraft manually with the autothrottle controlling the thrust. This was standard practice for China Airlines, and the speed was remaining within 4 to 5 knots of the requested 165 knots. The commander was visual with the runway and decided to continue with the approach. At this point, everything was relatively stable for the conditions. The co-pilots noticed the speed quickly reducing from the expected 165 knots to 157 knots. He called speed, and the thrust levers were moved forward to stop the speed reducing. This quickly increased the speed to 175 knots, and as a result, the commander moved the thrust levers to the fully closed position. The aircraft was around 70 feet from the ground. The rate of descent was very high. At 50 feet, low on the approach profile and still dropping fast, the commander attempted to flare the aircraft to reduce the rate of descent and extend the landing point. This had little effect on the descent of the aircraft. At the same time, the aircraft's speed suddenly dropped by a further 20 knots. The headwind that was providing an extra 20 knots had moved during the variable wind conditions. This led to a significant decrease in lift. The commander lifted the nose once again to reduce the rate of descent, but the thrust levers remained closed. With the speed low and reducing, the aircraft continued to descend at a rate of 1,000 feet per minute. Before, at 18:44, the right landing gear of Flight 642 struck the ground. With the force of 2.6 G and an aircraft that was very close to its maximum landing weight, caused the right landing gear to collapse. The aircraft tilted to the right with the right engine scraping along the runway, causing the aircraft to veer to the right. The co-pilots called the commander to go around, but with the aircraft now heading towards the grass, the commander did not apply any power, as the consequence could make the situation worse. As the aircraft left the runway, the right wing was ripped off, causing the rest of the plane to roll to the right. The aircraft spun around and ended up coming to a stop, inverted, facing the opposite direction. A large fire broke out due to the masses of fuel now leaking out of the aircraft. In the aircraft, it fell into darkness. Only the lights from the fire and the dim emergency lights lit up the cabin. Most of the passengers found themselves hanging upside down, being held up by their seatbelts. The cabin crew immediately began searching for torches to assist with the evacuation. This became more difficult due to the inverted position of the aircraft and the amount of debris that covered the ceiling, now the floor. The cabin crew and many passengers now started to evacuate. Within 1 minute of the crash, the airport firefighting and rescue teams arrived on scene and immediately started to fight the fires. Several firefighters then entered the cabin at 18:48, just 4 minutes after the start of the crash. They entered both through the access doors and the holes in the fuselage caused by the crash. They began assisting with the evacuation and bringing the passengers to safety. For the pilots, they found themselves upside down and disorientated. They attempted to pull the fire handles but were having difficulty locating them. They turned off the engine fuel switches before exiting the cockpit and assisting with the evacuation. Once all the dust had settled and the evacuation was complete with the fires out, the scale of the damage could be seen. One of the most astounding parts of this story is that out of the 315 people on board this plane, 312 survived, with 2 people dying at the scene and 1 5 days later in hospital. 6 crew members and 45 passengers did suffer serious injuries. This incident, as with most of them, is a result of many small factors aligning to create a larger one. For the majority of this flight, the flight crew were on top of their actions and fully aware of what was to come, constantly updating themselves on the visibility and wind to ensure they had the full picture before commencing the landing. The misunderstanding of which runway they were on didn't directly lead to this incident, but it was a small factor that added to the pressure and reduction in capacity of the crew. The main factor was the inability to reduce the rate of descent on the final stages of the approach. If the commander had introduced some thrust as the speed was reducing, this could have extended the landing flare and softened the landing. Again, most of these factors occurred within a few seconds. The loss of the headwind came as the crew were already fighting against the crosswind, variable winds, visibility issues, and turbulence. The wind shear was masked by the previous moments of variable winds. Other factors, such as the weight of the aircraft, also played a part. At the point of landing, the aircraft weighed 429,557 pounds, or 195,454 kilograms. The maximum allowable landing weight for the MD-11 was 430,000 pounds, or 195,655 kilograms. That means that at the point of landing, they were only 443 pounds, or 201 kilograms, below their maximum landing weight. After the investigation into this incident was completed, there were several safety recommendations that were suggested. A few of the main ones were that China Airlines should review its MD-11 training syllabuses to ensure the crew monitor the automated systems on the flight deck so as to be ready to intervene or override manually whenever necessary. It was also suggested that China Airlines, in association with the Boeing company, amend the recommended landing procedure in the MD-11 standard operating procedure to include procedures for approaches and landings in more demanding weather conditions. It was also recommended for China Airlines to ensure that crosswind landing limitations are noted in its publications that are consistent throughout. China Airlines also needed to re-emphasize to flight crews the need on instrument approaches to continue to monitor the flight instruments on the final stages of the approach. This was an extraordinary event. It was not an easy situation to deal with. Yes, it's easy to say 25 years after the fact that they should have gone around or added thrust to reduce the rate of descent. These are correct observations, but as we all know, it's easy to say when you are not in the moment or under all that extra pressure that comes with flying commercially, especially around storms. The microburst or wind shear that occurred at 50 feet made the situation all the more difficult to combat, and without all the other distractions, perhaps the crew would have caught it early and been able to carry out a wind shear recovery. This was an unbelievable event, further compounded by the video recording of the actual incident, the survival rate, and the absolute amazing response by the emergency services. I hope you found this video interesting and that you are having an amazing day. As always, I'll see you in the next one.